know John from other contexts, but he was not here last year.
The VSO concept.
The VSO concert, okay. Did you introduce that?
I didn't.
But you were one of the people, right, that were,
Yeah, sorry.
yeah.
Farmers Night.
Your wife plays for the VSO?
Yes, but it was, I think because it was Farmers Night that bringing up the John. So last year we had Representative Supernaut introduce this bill, and so he did come in and walk us through it. We now have it, and it seemed like it was long enough ago that we should probably just have a quick refresher on it. So thank you for coming back. And do you want to put it up?
So Sophie Sadatni for the Office of Legislative
Before you
Counsel.
get started here, one question, Representative
What do you
O'Brien.
mean we now have it?
It's now in our possession. It was not before.
Okay, was it just,
It was in House Housing. House General.
General and Housing.
okay,
All right, so I'm putting it up, but I also have copies of the bill. That would be helpful for folks. I also shared with the committee some resources. So obviously you can't click on the links on the paper, but just so you're aware what they are, but they are on the committee website. So I just thought that that might be helpful for you to have. It's a bit larger. So yes, this bill was introduced last session and it was referred to the Committee on General and Housing. And then I believe just last week, that committee was relieved of the bill and it came over here. But because it dealt with agricultural workers and because Heather, Representative Supernaut, was on this committee, I came in, I think it was May 21st, and did a walkthrough at that time. So this bill essentially does three primary things. So it moves to repeal the exemption of agricultural workers from the applicability of the State Minimum Wage Act. That in turn would also provide overtime pay for agricultural workers, but it includes a different limit. So instead of the more normal 40 hours a week, it provides for 60 hours a week as being when agricultural workers would receive overtime. And then the bill also proposes providing inspections to determine the adequacy of farm employee housing, and then a mechanism for how to address violations of that. So those are the three main things that the bill is seeking to do. I would just point out, and it's on your resource list that I just shared, this work really started, I think, with the committee. There was a study committee created by the legislature on agricultural workers and looking at labor and employment laws related to them. And there was a report that was issued in December of 2024, and Chair Durfee and Heather Supernaut were both on that committee. And so that's provides some of the background. So again, so just over a year ago now, but a lot of the information around agricultural workers is contained in that report. So it's also helpful to take a look at that. So moving forward, this, and again, if you're not familiar with it, under our employment practices laws, it's a little convoluted on how we do this, but essentially on the minimum wage section of the Fair Employment Practices Act, it provides that employees are entitled to receive minimum wage, and then it carves out a whole series of people that are not considered employees for purposes of minimum wage. And as of right now, it includes any individual employed in agriculture. So they're not covered by the state minimum wage at this point. So what this bill would propose doing is providing that individuals employed in agriculture, unless you're the agricultural employer's parent, spouse, or child, you would now be covered by the State Minimum Wage Act. And so moving into 384, this is the current language on minimum wage. There's a formula that's used each year to increase the minimum wage. Right now, it's $14.42 at the state level. The federal level is $7.25 an hour. That has not changed since 2009. But the way this formula works, it typically goes up each year. So that's the current minimum wage language. And then this gets into the overtime piece. So again, you have to be an employee that's covered by these provisions in Title 21. And normally it provides that you receive overtime if you work in excess of 40 hours a week, if you're a covered employee. And this would add in some language that would provide that individuals employed in agriculture would receive 1.5 times their regular wage for hours worked in excess of 60 hours a week. And then it has January 1st, 2026. Again, if the committee moves forward with this bill, you'd want to adjust the dates in it because this was, introduced last session. The reason 60 hours a week is, and you will see if you go look at the Agricultural Study Committee report in Appendix 4, there was a matrix that looked at state-by-state comparison of employment laws for agricultural workers. And there was a lot of testimony and discussion in that committee around overtime. And this in excess of 60 hours a week would sort of put Vermont in line with some of those other states that provide overtime for agricultural workers. There aren't many, but those that do, it's at a higher rate. And some of them are in the process of scaling back. So it starts at 60 hours a week. And then after a year or two, it's 55 hours a week and then 50 hours a week to try to get it down to 40 hours a week. But this bill proposes starting at 60 hours a week. And again, it wouldn't apply if the individual working on the agricultural employer is a parent, spouse, or child. And then the Section 4 is adding a new section into the state law. And this would be under Title 6, which deals with agriculture. This would be a new chapter that deals with adequacy of farm employee housing. And it uses some of the current definitions. So one, a farm would have the same meaning as in Section 2.14 of the required agricultural practices. I think maybe there needs to be rule in there, but I'm not sure. You guys would know that better than I would. But I looked in the statute to see, and sometimes they just say required agricultural practices, and sometimes it's required agricultural practices rule. So again, if you take the bill up, that might be something to look at. The definition of farm employee is an individual employed by a farm employer for farming. Farm employee housing has a definition: housing owned or controlled by a farm employer, whether located on or off the farm premises, and provided for the occupancy of the farm employees and the farm employees' family or household members. And then it has the definition of a farm employer, again, going back to the required agricultural practices definition. And the same for farming is referring back to those definitions. And then what the approach this proposes taking is that when the Secretary of Agriculture, Food and Markets there's a scheduled inspection of a farm under Chapter 215, which I believe was the water quality. So when they're planning on going to a farm, the Secretary would determine whether or not there's any farm employee housing in use on the farm. If there is, they would then conduct a survey of the farm employees regarding the adequacy, availability, and safety of the farm employee housing. And to facilitate the survey, the Secretary would provide the farm employees with a form containing questions regarding the housing. And then there's a list of things, these are a minimum of what the form would include. So these are the list of the questions that would be asked. And again, there could be additional questions. But is the farm employee housing provided voluntarily, or are you required to reside in the farm employee housing as a condition of employment? Is the housing provided in clean working order? Does the employer provide proper and timely maintenance without undue delay? Do you pay rent for the farm employee housing? If you pay rent, does the rent reduce your net wages below the prevailing minimum wage? Does the farm employee housing provide sleeping areas with doors and other ability to maintain privacy? Is the farm employee housing provided with adequate heat, safety, ventilation, windows, or temperature control? And these were some of the questions that were raised again in testimony that came up in front of the study committee regarding concerns around some of the farm housing. Subdivision 2 here provides that if the Secretary knows prior to an inspection that there are employees living in housing, then the form would be made available prior to the inspection, and then they would collect it when they go. And again, the Secretary would make sure that the form is provided in multiple languages. So again, if there are employees working that English is not their first language, providing information to them so they could do the survey as well. And then if the secretary determines that the farm employer has obstructed the completion of the survey, then there's an administrative penalty that can be imposed. And then subsection or section 4753 provides that the forms would be provided to the Division of Fire Safety. The Division of Fire Safety is the one that inspects housing, rental housing, to inform them on whether the Division of Fire Safety should then conduct a more thorough inspection of the farm employee housing to determine whether it's safe for occupation. If they conduct an inspection, they would then determine whether or not it meets the code. And if it does not, then they would issue, they would find them in violation. And then if they fail to comply with any of the requirements or timelines from the Division of Fire Safety, then again, there would be administrative penalties related to that. And obviously the effective date, if you were to move forward, would need to be amended. So that is an overview of the bill.
I know that you've passed it out, Sophia, and it's on our webpage too. Thank you for assembling all of those resources. There's a lot there. Not least of which is the pretty lengthy report that the study committee produced a year and a half ago. And we had 8 people on that committee. 4 of them were House members, 4 senators. There was little that the committee was able to agree on unanimously. Little, if anything. Who was on the committee?
It was David
Representative-
Murphy was the chair. Then Representative Ashley Bartley, who's on General and Housing, Robin Chestnut Benjamin, Heather Supernant, and then on the Senate side, it was Irene Renner, who was the vice chair, Senator Randy Brock, Senator Brian Collmore, and Senator Acacia Ron Hinsdale.
And I think the one area of consensus, remind me or if I've got this wrong, tell me what's wrong. But I think the one area of consensus was that we thought recommending to the legislature working on employment law rather than labor law made sense. So we were looking really originally at should farms be allowed to unionize, farm workers, that is. And then in addition to that, what about all the other employment law rights that most workers have that farm workers don't have? So minimum wage, overtime, workers' comp, maybe. Yeah, there was a list of them. And the feeling was, well, maybe we want to focus on those rather than unionizing, which could, be a bigger issue. In any case, I think the 4 House members all did come to some consensus, and it's all in the report anyway, on the minimum wage piece. The 2 of the senators did not, I believe, but I think the 4 House members all were comfortable with the minimum wage after hearing the testimony, quite a bit of testimony. We did not, I think, have unanimous House agreement on the overtime piece. Although that we may have been talking about a 40-hour overtime in that context rather than a 60-hour. And then the housing form, I think that Representative Supernant, I don't want to speak on her behalf at all, but we discussed this, it certainly came up, but I don't think we spent a lot of time focusing on it in our study group, other than the fact that it's provided for many farm workers, as we've heard, and that the employers can legally deduct some money, not a lot of money, for housing. And I asked the Department of Labor here if they would come back in and help us understand in this context. We looked at that last week when we had testimony on the H-2A visa program, but it could very easily also come into play here, since many farm workers who are year-round workers also have housing and currently are not, but would be eligible for a minimum wage under this. So questions for Sophie or just for general? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Sophie would know the answer to this, but I'm wondering in terms of the 60-hour number, how many farm employees would work more than 60 hours on an even vaguely regular basis? I mean, is that common? I mean, I know when I think about some of the workers that have come from Jamaica, I've heard that they work really long hours, but I don't know more than 60 would be
Yeah,
possible.
I think that we can certainly hear anecdotally from the farm groups and maybe even some of the folks around the table here. I did invite the farmer organizations if they would like to help us with that. Also, I think the Department of Labor, our own Vermont Department of Labor has that data, since, I think they're collecting that. Yeah,
Question, Chair Durfee. My reading through this, it seemed that this only applied to large farms and medium farms, which are a very tiny percentage of Vermont farms. Is that accurate or did I misread that?
It covers, sorry, I've got to find where I had all my. The definition is the same as in section 2.14 of the required agricultural practices. And that defines it as a parcel or parcels of land owned, leased, or managed by a person and devoted primarily to farming, as defined in section 2.16 of this rule. And it meets the threshold criteria as established in section 3 of this rule, provided that the leasee controls the leased land to the extent they would be considered as part of the leasee's own farm. Indicators of control may include whether the leasee makes day-to-day decisions concerning the cultivation or other farming-related use of the leased lands, and whether the leasee manages the land for farming during the lease period. So there's a whole slew of then references to other definitions.
So where did I see
yeah, I
that?
think you saw a reference to that in the housing survey section, maybe. So where was that?
Is any, I mean, other than the reference to how farm is defined?
I thought there was some sort of
I think.
about just.
Yeah, I think on page 4, line 4. There's a reference to,
Oh, yeah, farm employer means a person engaged in farming who's required to obtain a large farm permit or medium farm permit under chapter 215 of this title, or is subject to the required agricultural practices under chapter 215 of this title, and who earns at least 1/4 of their annual gross income from the business of farming.
So A and B included all the other farm employees.
Yeah, and I don't, this is not my area of expertise, so I really am not familiar with all the
yeah.
We
the
see
rules
what
and
I'm
the sizes.
looking at.
Yeah, and I think that, so in this case, farm employer is only, as you're saying, the large and medium farmers. And I think this only applies to this section of the bill, so it's just a reference to this housing survey. So there's an existing, apparently, we'll have to ask about this. Currently, the ag agency or somebody is going out to farms that have housing and is inspecting them. How often, I don't know.
Right, so that wouldn't impact the minimum wage and the overtime provisions.
But not impact.
Right.
So that, those provisions as written.
You're right.
Apply to all.
Right.
Okay. Chuck,
You probably said as we went through here, but what are the consequences if you don't pay the minimum wage?
Complaint would be filed with the Department of Labor, and then there would be administrative penalties through the Department of Labor for violations of the minimum wage and
Is that
overtime.
another section of law?
It's within Title 21, right? It's under, yeah. So what the first couple of sections are doing is just adding in, so the agricultural workers would be covered by existing state law regarding minimum wage and overtime. It's not a separate standalone piece for them.
How would this apply to undocumented workers who, I mean, would it apply to them even though they probably wouldn't feel confident to file a complaint?
yes, it would. I mean, it would, whether in practical terms, right, how that would work is a separate question.
But it would apply.
Right. So, I mean, and I just wanted to loop back to what Representative Durfee said before. So one of the reasons the committee heard a lot of testimony, from different farmer representatives of the farm workers organizations. But what was interesting, there was also testimony in front of the committee around unionized. Several states do allow agricultural workers to unionize. And interestingly, the history was that they just don't. They just don't get together and unionize and collectively bargain. And I think that was one of the reasons why the committee decided it would be better to address sort of working conditions through these other laws rather than through a standalone Labor Relations Act covering agricultural workers.
At the end of the day, to organize.
It was a very, very interesting testimony.
Play soccer.
The,
Maybe they're not.
it's not here visible anywhere, Sophia, but the existing minimum wage law in Vermont, and the federal minimum wage law superseded by the state law. High school age, or doesn't apply to younger people, and I'm not sure how that's defined.
For the youth, I mean, in terms of how much they're paid.
Yeah, my understanding is that the existing minimum wage law doesn't cover somebody who's under a certain age or is a high school student.
So the laws currently provide that there are certain occupations you can't do and at different ages. And I can just double check on. I mean, I think there are rules around, you shouldn't be doing the heavy equipment stuff. I don't know if that's
Farming.
That's something you don't have to look it up on the fly. We can
Okay.
circle back on that. That's a question I know that's come up. And then there are also, and I asked you this yesterday, after looking at the resources, I saw internships and apprenticeships, and we all know that many farms, smaller farms often have people who work either in one capacity or the other, and wanted to be sure that if we were to change the law and not exempt agricultural workers, that wouldn't be affected.
So for things like internships, to truly have an unpaid internship, it's quite a strict test. And you need to meet all the criteria for that. And if you don't meet them, then you have to pay at least minimum wage to those individuals. And then apprenticeships, the one resource that I linked was specifically for farm employees, and it just referred to the Department of Labor on their apprenticeship programs. And then when I looked into that more, then it referred to the federal Department of Labor and apprenticeship programs. And often those can be, you earn while you learn sort of situations, but I don't have any specific knowledge around farms. I did see on the state Vermont Department of Labor website has a list of registered employers that have apprenticeship programs, and I just did a search for farm and some terms to see if there were any, and I didn't see any, or listing farming as an occupation. They were like, some of them have them, like there's I think Cabot has is part of the program, but it's for electricians and other categories.
I mean, there's a really big international program called WWOOFing, Willing Workers on Organic Farms. And I know there are farmers in Vermont who basically the idea is sort of like an alternative to a youth hostel. Young people that are traveling might go and spend, 2 weeks on an apple farm and pick apples in exchange for staying in basically the equivalent of farm worker housing. And so, I mean, I would think I guess I would like to know the answer to this, because I know people that use WWOOFing as part of their, part of the way they get labor done on their farm. And so I would like to know the answer to whether that counts as an internship, or because sometimes it's paid, but usually it's not. Usually it's it's the room and board is given in exchange for a certain amount of labor, and usually it's like a half a day or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's probably skirting around the law, to be honest. So one of the resources that I linked was there's a specific Department of Labor resource that deals with farm employees.
Yeah.
And in that, it talks about volunteers, and it points out that generally an individual can only volunteer for public agencies such as a state government or a nonprofit corporation. An individual that volunteers for a for-profit business must be paid the applicable minimum wage.
You know, many firms that are for profit right now. Any of them.
That also reminds me of agritourism, where, farm stays where you vacation and part of the experience is yeah. We do have, I did ask all the farm groups if they would like to testify on this, and I was thinking particularly of the point you raised, so. And then,
I don't know I know some people, but I don't know if they're gonna want to testify on the record if that's the way it is.
yeah, well, we'll need to know and.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right,
That would
John,
be
did you have a,
interesting.
Yeah, just,
Yeah.
John?
I don't know much about, what we require statutorily in Vermont, but I was just thinking like, if you work a 40-hour week, what is required of your employer as far as, obviously an ag minimum wage isn't necessarily even required, but are there other things that are required statutorily in Vermont?
Minimum wage.
If you work, that relationship between employer, employee.
I mean, there are certain other groups that are carved out from that definition of employee for minimum wage. So things like amusement parks. I mean, that's just an odd list of professions. But primarily, we also look at the Fair Labor Standards Act. So there are a number of employees that don't receive overtime, and those are if you're, professional, administrative, managerial, supervisory. I mean, there's a whole list of exceptions from receiving overtime. So overtime, generally speaking, is for, the lowest paid workers that are paid on an hourly basis. There could be some hourly workers that aren't eligible, and vice versa. There could be some salaried employees that are eligible for overtime. But that's all, I mean, it's very, a lot of regulation around exactly who receives it and who doesn't. But the easiest way to think about it is there's usually hourly employees who work on an hourly basis are the ones that are entitled to receive overtime.
But the sort of suite of other things like, holidays off or sick days, are those statutorily required, or is it purely the relationship between employer and employee?
No, we have extensive laws on that. So,
You do?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And I was wondering if any of those would be triggered by a minimum wage coming into effect for ag workers. Is there anything tied to that? Well, besides maybe overtime?
Right, not specifically. So where this would be in the statute is it's around minimum wage and overtime. And there are different definitions of employees depending on which sections of the statute that you're under. So for example, under parental and family leave, which is unpaid leave, there's a different definition of what an employee is to qualify for that. So yeah, as the different things that are in statute, there are different definitions for employee for those purposes. So this would be just affecting, right, the minimum wage. And
But like maternity, paternity leave is in statute that you have to offer that. For
right, that
example,
would be under the Parental and Family Leave Act. So you
Okay.
have to work a certain number of hours. The employer has to have a certain number of employees. So there are different eligibility requirements to be covered.
Any other questions? Yes, John.
The way all this intersects with labor law can get kind of confusing. I'm looking at on page 3, number 9, a bit about 60 hours overtime. If the minimum wage is increased in that previous part of the bill and 9 wasn't there, would that mean that farm workers would have to be paid overtime just like any other worker, or does there have to be some language in there?
Yeah, so what you'd be doing is under the first section, under section 2, you would be including individuals employed in agriculture as under the definition of employee. And then in section 3, because they're now an employee, for the purposes of this, then they would be eligible to receive overtime at 40 hours a week, unless you have that that language in number 9, which says you're eligible at 60 hours.
Wasn't there at all, they would be eligible at 40 hours.
Right, unless you had it, right, some other language to carve them out, right?
Some other language.
Right, they said they're not eligible for
But if
time.
that was gone, they'd be.
Right,
So that would be a policy decision that we could write in one, yeah,
We can't just strike that section without.
Striking that section would not do that.
Consequences.
yes, good point, very good point. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for waiting and for giving us this second walkthrough.
you're welcome.
And I'll have to say, I didn't really remember any of it, so. Yeah, and I noticed that we had invited the Department of Labor, I think we've invited the Ag Agency, and then there's the Division of Fire Safety, which is referenced here too. I guess that's probably in public safety, but.
So they're in charge of like rental housing, they oversee all that and make sure that they're, all the.
Alright, so we might also have them come in. All right, good, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So committee, we're back tomorrow. So we can wrap up for the day, Chuck. We're back tomorrow